Welcome to this episode of Leaders with Purpose. I'm Rebecca Hull, MD of Manifesto, and today we're joined by Jim Bowes, CEO of Designability.
And I'm Lou Lai, Chief Client and Transformation Officer at Manifesto. And in this episode, we're going to cover Jim's journey from agency founder to CEO of a charity. We're going to unpack what it means to do strategic discovery through to actually execution and really thinking about how you focus your resources on having the most impact for the organisation. It is my huge pleasure and Rebecca's to welcome Jim Bowes to this podcast episode. Jim, would you mind introducing yourself and what you're up to now? And then we're definitely going to unpick kind of how you got here.
So I'm Jim Bowes. I'm the CEO of a charity called Designability. We are a design charity that designs inclusive products for disabled people that remove barriers from their day-to-day life.
Those that don't know, Jim and I go back a long time. We know each other super well. But for those of our listeners who don't, could you unpack some of your story for us? Because I think there's a super interesting lens about transformation yourself, not just taking organisations through change.
Yeah, I mean, look, we can go back a long way, but there's probably a bit that is what I did last that is one of the sort of like direct connections. So I founded Manifesto and wrote the original Manifesto. But in terms of my professional journey, it goes back. I've worked since the age of 8, so I don't know how long you want this podcast to be, but it could get really extensive. And I think I've learned things in all of those roles. When I was 8, I worked for a man called Jeff who ran the local pub, and I bottled up in the bit when the pub is closed. So I would go home from school and I would like fill up all the fridges. And what I learned from Jeff as a leader was he didn't like letting go of his money. So I was paid £8 a week for that job, and he tried to sell me something at the end of every week when it was time to pay me. And my job was to avoid falling into the trap he set for me, because he wanted to hold on to his money and just offload something that he already owned. But perhaps as we get I won't go through everything all the way through. But my journey, I really enjoyed secondary school. I went to a great secondary school. There were some great teachers there. And when I transitioned to sixth form, it became all about university. And I didn't identify as someone, I didn't really see university as somewhere I wanted to go. I'm someone that learns through doing. And in being someone that learns through doing, you want to start doing. And I'd sort of run little businesses all the way through school. I'd sold chocolates and I'd done things here and there. And at the time I was sound engineering on the side, running a little sound engineering business. And ultimately I dropped out of dropped out of sixth form to manage a band, which wasn't a great career choice in many ways. But one of the things that it did create an opportunity for was getting into the internet, because bands are brilliant at promoting themselves and they're always jumping on new technologies to sort of promote their music and their band. And that was where I first learned about websites. And that led to an opportunity to work for a UK startup that had been funded by BMG Records. And that really led me into my entire career, which sort of kicked off from the world of digital. And the good thing about that period of time in digital was, as long as you knew 2 things more than the next person or the person interviewing you, then you probably got the job. And I was that person. I built 4 websites. I hadn't even entirely built them. I got some help from a friend. I'd been involved in 4 websites at the point that I got the job as a UK editor of an entertainment website that was coming over from Sweden to the UK, and met a fascinating leader there, a man called Peter Carnello, who ran Sweden's only product placement business. And he was a bit bonkers, but in a good way, and very focused, had great vision. He would make public statements about what he wanted to achieve to hold himself to account. And I definitely learned a lot from him. Fast forward many years, I ran Manifesto, and now I run a charity.
I mean, major transformations, and there's, I think there's lots of your story, Jim, that will resonate with people who perhaps don't want to follow a traditional path, or, who feel that you have to have some sense of vision or ambition from where, to where you want to get to. I mean, at the beginning, did you have a sense of this is where I want to be and I'm working towards it, or were you just opening yourself up to opportunity?
I think, when it comes to like true intrinsic personal motivation, I think there was some of it was from a sort of slightly negative energy place. I had felt like I had something to prove. I think the lack of academic achievement from coming from a pretty modest background, I sort of wanted to sort of just prove I could be a success. And that wasn't driven entirely from good energy. It was just, I want to do something with my life and achieve something. It wasn't particularly directed, but over time, I just tried everything until I found things that where I could excel.
So you've sort of touched on some of the sort of earlier intrinsic motivators, and now obviously you're doing, a really important role in an amazing organisation. So I wonder what purpose, sort of how your relationship with purpose, and at what point did that start to take on different meaning for you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the journey with Manifesto is an interesting one. So in August 2011, I wrote the first version of the Manifesto. And that document, and the Manifesto is different now, it's built by you and the team, but that first one was really a reflection of me as a person. So to go on a journey where the business changed its name and I knew it was my time to sort of leave, that you have to unpick who you are versus the thing that you've been busy creating. And the first period after that was difficult because you're not really sure what you want to do. You sort of know that you're a little bit burnt out by what you had been doing, but what you need more than anything is time to sort of unpack what could be a good thing to do now. And for me, I have a daughter, Millie, who has Down syndrome. So I have a connection to disability. And in that sort of that year, I'm like still processing really what that means and how my life is different to that of parents with typical children. And what do I want to do about that, and how relevant is that to my wider life outside of just being her dad? At the same time, I'm sort of still unpicking this sort of change in my life where I'd done the same thing for a decade. And so what I found was in the first year, I did sort of consultancy work where I really, like a bit like today, told old stories about my life to people and then chipped in a few ideas about their business. And that's nice. And it's quite an easy way to make a living if there's people that want you to do it for them. But it is sort of hollow. For me, I'm sure some people that do that find it very fulfilling. I'm not one of them. And this time, maybe I will in the future. And so really, I was sort of silently searching for something that would make me feel like I wanted to do it. And that's what I found, really. I'd applied for one job in that year, and that one job was the job as CEO of Designability.
Amazing. And in terms of that, like, making the decision to sort of, okay, I've done this thing for a decade, I now need to sort of find a new purpose and a sense of fulfillment. That shift from like agency, fast pace, that energy to actually I'm the CEO of an organisation, kind of like, what were there any things that you kind of had to unlearn? Okay, I need to sort of maybe not apply this type of thinking, and also anything that surprised you?
It's been really hard. There's so much there that, for starters, as someone that had been here for the whole journey at Manifesto, generally, if I had an idea, people were kind of up for it. The level of sort of skepticism of anything I said in the new organisation was much higher because, there's a bit of like, who is this agency guy that's turned up to run a charity? Maybe my team are saying they don't feel like that at all, but for me, and obviously sometimes it's more about how we're feeling than what people are actually thinking. But I was really conscious that this is an organisation that was founded in 1968. I'm a custodian of it for a period of time, as we all are in our roles. But you feel a smaller part of its overall journey, and yet you're like absolutely focused on some things that really need to happen. And so that sort of, if anything, to begin with, it was just quite humbling because I didn't have anywhere near as much credit in the bank. You basically arrive and you start with a zero balance. And I hadn't done that for a really long time.
Yeah. And in terms of then, what did that change in you? Did it change how you show up in the organisation, how you maybe sort of ran certain kind of projects or meetings, and I guess like building that credibility, with the board of trustees. We're both trustees, so you kind of, there is that relationship with the CEO is really, really important.
Yeah. What I'll say is the trustees have been great. 7 of them interviewed me. So in a way, you sort of almost feel like you've kind of got the backing of a majority right from the beginning. So I think I always felt that they were on board. I think some of the challenges that I observed as I started the role were perhaps bigger than any of us had appreciated, before I'd started. And so it's been good to know that they had a level of idea about those and were on board with what needed to happen in the organisation. I think one of the things that's interesting about recruitment for leaders in the charity sector is you often have these part-time volunteers that lead the process for a senior recruitment. And depending on the different organisations' approach, the other members of a leadership team might have quite a limited role in the decision. And that is the case here. I just had a single panel interview with the other leadership team members, but they also weren't, their influence was contained, I suppose. And I think, that's an appropriate way to do it, but it is also potentially a difficult way to do it, particularly if I was absolutely not the person they wanted, because we're the group that have to work together every day.
Yeah, definitely. With the challenges you sort of mentioned and you sort of shared, kind of being on this sort of year-long discovery kind of journey of okay, what are we here to do? How are we going to get there? What's our North Star? So I guess it'd be great to hear a bit about that discovery journey, what were you doing, but also what were the lessons that you took from agency life, the digital kind of transformation stuff we've done together, and applied that to designability?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots in there. Firstly, I arrived to an existing strategy that needed to be delivered. But what often with a strategy, you can read it and interpret it in different ways. So what I read was some high-level goals that I had my own ideas for how I wanted to implement it. And what you need to do is sort of then test your own ideas and research and build the credibility on what your view of that world is. So it was interesting because for me, some people would probably not enjoy arriving to an existing strategy, but obviously I had the opportunity to read it before I got there, and I arrived to an existing framework within which to work. But what I saw was a lot of opportunity to apply the skills from agency life to effectively run a discovery process, review how the organisation generates its income and how the organisation creates impact. And, if anything, that felt like an agency project, and we're using my background. I think I probably did it in a leaner way than a lot of organizations would feel comfortable doing, because what we did is we reached out to lots of individual experts. So whether that was an impact expert or a corporate fundraising expert or you coming up with new commercial models in the charity sector expert, and we created individual pieces of work and consultancy with them and drew together a discovery process that came up with some really clear recommendations. And one of the things that I found interesting was there's lots of really outlandish ideas that you get excited about really early. But what I found was there was some real basics about how to diversify our income, how to articulate our impact more effectively, that are the job of the first couple of years.
Yeah. And how did you temper your sort of, as a natural, entrepreneurial visionary, let's hit the North Star? I remember you saying to me one time, Lou, we can do anything. We'll figure it out. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go with this. It's not my comfortable space. So how did you sort of temper your sort of connection to knowing that actually there's some foundational stuff that we really need to do now, and that's what's right for the organisation?
I mean, I think it's really fortunate they didn't get me when I was 30.
Okay.
Because I think it would have been a really bad mismatch of energy. But I think I'm ever so slightly more considered than I once was. And I think I just a little bit, I wouldn't say I'm well-rounded, but I'm slightly more rounded than I once was. And that means I can give consideration to priority, to capacity. And one of the things, that I'm sure lots of other people in the charity sector experience, I just don't have the resources at my disposal that I had when I ran a professional services or an agency business, because the business model is quite straightforward in a way. If the work is flowing in, you've got the delivery machine working, it's quite straightforward. But there's other layers of complexity, like not all of the money is created equal because a lot of it is restricted to a certain thing. And so you end up with sort of more complex financial dynamics. I obviously appreciate there are many, many challenges in a business like Manifesto, but they're just different.
My sense, having kind of observed sort of consultancies, work with people who at the end of their career think, I'm going to go and do a stint in the not-for-profit sector because that feels like a good place to sort of share my skills. What would you say that the differences are about managing and leading in that place? Because I think it is much more complex, as you've alluded to.
I think, you do get that assumption that some people think, I'll do a stint in a charity. And in many ways, that is the wrong attitude to go in with. I think you need to go in accepting that this is a challenge for you. So if you go into a charity thinking you're giving them the gift of your corporate experience, then you're setting yourself up for a fairly rude awakening. And what you need to go in is with a very open mind, and you should be thinking about how you upskill and cross-skill yourself to be able to meet the challenges of the sector, which are varied and different to those in a commercial business, and all commercial businesses obviously are different.
I think what you've said is really interesting. I hadn't ever sort of really considered it for you through that lens of you at the Manifesto from the beginning, and therefore, all of that, it's sort of history and momentum was sort of part of you inherently. And then now you're in this organisation which has existed for all these years without you. And, we've worked on transformation programs together. We've tried to do lots of change for lots of people through the agency. And sort of fundamentally, lots of that success boils down to sort of relationships, collaboration. So how are you finding taking people on that journey for whom they're like, who is Jim Bowes? Yeah.
Yes, it's really difficult for lots of reasons. Yeah, because I'm building that credit from the beginning. And yet I don't have lots of time, so I need it to move fairly quickly. But we also have lots of practical challenges. Like many organisations now, we work a hybrid model. Actually, we work a hybrid model and we're across 2 sites in Bath. And actually within our 2 sites, on one of them we're on 2 floors that are not directly connected to each other. And so you have that sort of physical challenge of only really at the moment being together 4 times a year, which is less than I would like. And I also live quite a long way from where we're based. So I'm in the office about 2 days a week. As someone that has like quite a strong preference actually for face-to-face working, particularly when trying to achieve transformative things. But I think what I've done is I've tried to really focus on what is the message here? Because also when you're doing a transformation, it's often not a massive transformation for everybody. There are often certain things you're trying to make a big change to. But how is that? I've always tried to keep in my mind, how is that felt across the organisation? Because if there's 10 people for whom the day-to-day looks very similar, but you want them to feel different about the organisation, what is it that sort of signifies the difference if what you do? So we make a powered wheelchair called a WYSIBUG for under 5s. If the primary part of your job is to build powered wheelchairs, and on day 1, you're building powered wheelchairs, and on day 5, after we've transformed everything, you're still building powered wheelchairs, much of what you feel and do and how you add value to the organisation is the same. And that's great. It's a good and important role for the organisation. But what we might like is for you to interact with your colleagues slightly differently, or we might like you to help our storytelling slightly differently. And so what do you do to make that not just feel like extra work and feel like an additional positive contribution? I am still learning on that process.
Again, arriving into an organisation that's existed without you, you have to take on their values. I'm curious, do you have values at Designability? How do they relate to sort of the overall strategy? And have you had to take these on to bring them to life in any way?
Yeah, and the organisation developed its first strategy before its current strategy. And as part of that process, they developed a set of values. And when I applied for the job, I really looked at the values that they had and went, are these things that I can live and I can be? And the values are practical. And, I'm a maker and a doer. And that's how I always sort of set out to be creative, and I'm certainly curious, and curiosity is important to me. Ambitious, which I think comes relatively naturally, and authentic. I've always tried to be. So they resonated with me enough to go, I can live by those. But what we've also done is create a set of behaviours that are a little bit easier to speak to how we want people to work with each other on a day-to-day basis. And that work is ongoing. One of the things I've learned about those is coming from an agency background, what you like to do is come up with a beautiful concept and tie a bow on it. But what you have to do as someone that runs an organisation is implement that. So we're currently working through this at the moment, that we came up with a concept to explore the 5 behaviours. We do things as a whole organisation, and then people split into subgroups and do a separate session to sort of unpack them a bit. But because people are coming from different places and are at different levels of confidence or familiarity with that way of workshopping things, it's maybe not actually a solution that works. And one of the things I've learned from that is you have to recognise how different people are in an organisation. And in our case, even though we're only about 30 people, we've got people whose backgrounds are from the NHS, we've got people whose backgrounds are from manufacturing, we've got people from comms and fundraising backgrounds, people from design engineering backgrounds at places like Dyson. And so their work experience and their outlook is actually like really, really varied.
Interesting. So those behaviours, they sort of underpin the values. And are you extrapolating those out in terms of, as a line manager or as a leader of a business unit, this is how I would expect you to be authentic in your role? Or are you saying to them, okay, bring that to life yourself?
We were hoping that people would, in these small groups, unpack them and bring them to life. I think one of our learnings really very recently is that we're going to need to sort of do a bit more work ourselves, sort of to take people on the journey of how they manifest in day-to-day working life. Because I think this stuff is hard, right? It's difficult to, when people have such varied backgrounds, to bring things to life in a way where people get it instantly requires a lot of work. And what I brought to it was kind of, this is how we did things in agencies. And what I really realised is actually we were more similar here than I'd appreciated.
Yeah, and that was, I guess, going to be one of my questions is that kind of openness for like sort of almost like co-design, working out in the open, which is just comes very natural when you're sort of in an agency space. Was that quite new to some members of the organisation? So yes, you've got the difference in backgrounds that show up in like a workshop, but in terms of like the discovery, what's next for the strategy, like how open and collaborative were you with the organisation?
Yeah, like people have always engaged in the sessions. So we've involved the whole organisation in team meetings, and we've got a whole part of the organisation that, co-designs products with disabled people. So you've got varying levels of comfort with those things because we kind of do it professionally in a small part of the organisation, and then it's less what happens in other parts. And we've got the WYSIBUG service that we deliver has well over 300 children under 5 with a powered wheelchair. That team is focused on delivering as many powered wheelchairs to as many under 5s as possible. So they have a really clear vision and a North Star for their part of the organisation. And that is, how many children can we help? In our design team, it's more complex because sometimes we tackle more systemic challenges like, why are all EV charging points inaccessible? And to see change in that space, you're really relying on local councils and manufacturers to make change over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And so even the pace of change we're seeking or pace of impact we're seeking in different parts of the organisation is quite different.
And with impact, so I guess coming into sort of designability, like you are like the organisation is one part of like a quite sort of complicated ecosystem. And so you've been sharing about kind of, okay, so what's the impact and change we need to kind of see? Okay, so what is our theory of change? So if we're going to achieve that North Star, and so how have you sort of taken the next sort of step in terms of, okay, this is our theory of change, and actually we now are operating in this systemic change that we're trying to influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a role to play in both direct impact, which WYSIBUG represents and our accessible pushchair represents, and inspiring others to make change in how they design products and services. And the way that we think about that really is that the world isn't designed for everybody, and it should be. Try and keep it sort of fairly simple. But we know that as designability alone, we can't bite off that entire challenge, which is why I think our work exists in two spaces. Now, for me, we should only make and design a product where the market doesn't have a suitable product to fulfill that need. So one of the things with WYSIBUG, we're designing the next version of it at the moment that will extend to an older age range. And we looked at, are there already manufacturers or people in the market that could help us make this so we don't need to? And when we looked at the existing manufacturers, actually, typically, powered wheelchairs are very heavy. And one of the things that makes a WYSIBUG unique is that it can be broken into parts that can be a one-person lift, and it will fit into a typical family car. And so there's something there from a pure design point of view that sets it apart as a product that makes it uniquely designability and uniquely sort of worth doing and pursuing. However, I would say if the market caught up and something replaced that and superseded it in the market, I would say our work is done in that space. And you can see that a few years ago, we did a lot of work for dementia-related products, and the market for those products has now developed substantially. So we still sell some of those through a licensing agreement, but our work designing in that space ran its course really, unless a new theme to investigate comes up.
Yeah. And with that idea of, so we talk about like collaboration, and actually for an organisation, it's not necessarily like you might not be best placed to actually meet this need, and actually we need to be convening others to tackle this problem. Where, did that feel like a natural part of the sort of discovery and theory of change, that actually there are other people in this system that can be part of the change?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know a lot of funders are keen for charities to work together more, and other types of partner. We're part of the National Centre for Accessible Transport, of which is consortium led by Coventry University, and we're one of the partners in that. And there are people that look after research, people that look after policy, and we're the sort of design partner in that, if you like. What we can say from that is it's quite hard running things where there are 6 partners involved, and that's not anybody's fault. It just requires a certain amount of admin, and I think probably everyone involved in that consortium slightly underestimated how much running the partnership takes. So I think how to run a partnership is definitely an observation, and how many partners is the optimum number if you're not very experienced at running partnerships would spring to mind. But that said, we're currently doing some really exciting work with some of the charities in the UK, developing some incredibly exciting products. And where there's sort of one-to-one partnership, that seems fairly doable. I don't know where between 1 and 20 it gets hardest, but somewhere on that continuum.
I'm thinking of Lou's mentoring, matching, administrative overhead.
Yes.
Yeah.
So gone from manual matching to using AI ethically to kind of actually power some of that stuff, and then use the humans to do the quality checking over that. So, and I guess you can both sort of as agency leaders, actually you have a pretty good access to like networks. If you think about kind of all of the agency networks, you've got Beamer, you've got Pod, all the things that we've been to. How different is it to accessing a CEO support network?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought much about the CEO support network until I became a charity CEO. Interestingly, like a few people contact you fairly quickly. So I've recently joined Akivo, which is the Association of Chief Execs for Voluntary Organisations, and I'm still sort of early in that journey, but those networks do exist. I'm also in a WhatsApp group of CEOs for, I guess, probably small to medium charities that are sort of loosely in a space associated with ours, and also you start to see people at the same events. So that process that you sort of see in agency world does start to happen. And then because we also offer a consultancy, we essentially do offer design services. You're sometimes left wondering what the what the ethics are of pitching yourself at another charity's event. So I was at an event for another charity a few weeks ago, and I started having a conversation with someone where I spotted a new business opportunity. I just went for it. Like, some instincts die hard, you know.
Love it. I mean, thank you for your sort of openness and I think humility of some of the journey that you've been on. And I was just really struck by what you talked about then about, if the market or businesses served the need better, then you would go and focus your efforts in other spaces. And that just struck me as sort of the wrong way round, that, the sort of drive for inclusion and understanding and meeting, making the world accessible for all is in the hands of these small, passionate organisations, small groups of people who are really striving to make a difference in the world. And I guess I'm interested, we've been on something of an inclusion journey through the early days of Manifesto. What's that been like for you now, and now sort of in an organisation where that's, through a very specific lens, like every day is a school day, right?
Yeah, and I've learned so much on it. And in terms of like thinking about what we should be doing versus what organizations should be doing, or what's the role we should play, it's really difficult. You're constantly balancing those things, because we're doing a project at the moment that will probably release some design guidance in the late autumn, around accessible vehicle design. And I look at the size of our organization, and what we're going to try and do there is tell the car industry how it should design cars. And that's lovely, but there's quite a lot of car industry to say, don't worry, we know how to design cars. So then what you end up looking for is, how big should we make the redesign suggestions here? Should we look for things that have any hope at all of being implemented, that they will go, neat little idea you've come up with there, and they sort of slightly pat us on the head and go, fine, we'll take it? Or do you go big and say, look, you're completely thinking about aspects of car design wrong for to meet the broadest amount of needs that you possibly can? And so you end up with these tensions in the work that we do, because really we want to take people that design cars on a journey. And with EVs becoming more popular and with interfaces in cars developing, actually what you're seeing is often cars are becoming less accessible, because as physical buttons get removed, or as the way that you have to access certain features become more complicated, actually you're not talking just about disabled people's experience, you're talking about just general cognitive overload in a vehicle because of how complex some aspects of them have become. So we think it's really important work, but we have to be sort of tactful in the way that we approach it. And ideally, we would have the resources to really work extensively with industry, but that's where it can be difficult to have the resources to do that.
It's at the intersections of various aspects as well that often is forgotten, isn't it? So everyone's really got this siloed view of, okay, we understand how it works in this space, but then when you add in, like you say, a neurodivergent aspect, or, just being humans in this world, it starts to feel very different in terms of an accessible solution.
Yeah, and I think, obviously recently there's been so much going on in the world, and there was a period of time where perhaps inclusivity and things like diversity was slightly higher on the agenda than they are now. And so we're also, reminding people a lot of the time that these things are important. They can have massive commercial benefit to your organization, and designing things. We believe what we are talking about is just good design. We don't think it's particularly unusual or particularly special. We think people are often forgetting lots of people in their design process. And part of our job is just to remind people that you can include more people in your design process, and you will get a better product from that will be more successful for everybody.
One of the things that I think anyone who knows you will know that, you have an instinct for an opportunity. You love a pitch potentially, or the opportunity to take on a challenge and see where you can take it. And I wonder whether you have a sense of, perhaps historically in the charity sector, things have been much more contained within sort of functions, and lots of sort of similar ways of approaching fundraising, for example, have played out. Do you think that there's a sort of a need for, charities to be more opportunistic in positioning themselves for the future. And what would your advice be? I mean, like, you are like a whiz at being in the room. I've got this thing, I'm going to talk it through. Like, if you're not someone of your disposition and you think, well, I really got this hunch, I want to speak to these people about this thing, what would your advice be?
I mean, I would find some close, critical friends and start talking through the ideas and things you want to do. And I've started to build a sort of set of new ones that already sort of knew the charity. And I've gone, oh, who's this person that already likes us, and what do they do, and what ideas can I get feedback on for them? So one of the people that's a business owner that already worked with us as a charity, I've actually reviewed a couple of things for them and given my feedback, and then I've done it sort of reciprocally. So sort of just try and create those sounding boards where you get to sort of test and iterate ideas. I think, what I would say is, my experience so far has been that there's loads of amazing ideas I'd love to work on. The resources I have make it hard to do all of them. So I have really had to choose. And where I've ended up is probably some of the things are the more obvious that need tackling first. In terms of like how hard it is to raise money or fundraise or bring income into charities at the moment, I think that's just a universal challenge for the sector. I think we're seeing a lot of organisations reducing their workforce. And, to be honest, I'd love it if I had a massive endowment and didn't have to worry about bringing in any money at all, because then I could just get on with changing the world, But that's not the situation. So we have to sort of work with the situation we're in, which is ultimately to convince major donors, to convince corporates to join in, to convince the trusts and foundations that have supported us for so long that there are interesting, new and exciting projects. And part of our job is to demonstrate our impact and tell brilliant stories about the difference we make.
Yeah, storytelling is so important. And sometimes I think in organisations and businesses, you don't feel like you've got the space to do that. You're not encouraged to do that. Everything's quite binary, black and white. But really, if you can make people feel something about the work that you're doing, that's probably half the battle, I'd suggest.
And one of the things I think we will definitely do in the next 6 months is look at our tone of voice, and we will probably be a little bit bolder than we have been in our tone of voice, because we've traditionally been very friendly and warm, and that's great. We want to be those things, but we also need to get a bit more cut through with some of our messages, because we're a design charity, and it could be easy to think that other causes are more important, but design affects every aspect of our day, or all of our days, all of the time. And so when things are well designed, it actually does make a genuinely better world, and we need to convey that as effectively as we can.
My last question, I guess it's for both of you. You're both sort of trustees, but Jim, you've been a trustee, you're now a CEO. You're right, you're the ham in the sandwich of the workforce and the trustee in the organisation. How often that's a hard job as a trustee. You're there to safeguard and to govern at arm's length in a short amount of time. How have you sort of found that experience being on the other side of the trustee relationship, and anything that you'd share about that?
One thing I'll say is, historically I've been the recipient of extensive packs of papers as a trustee. I hadn't given enough thought to the person writing them. Now that I'm the person that is often writing them, along with my leadership team, who write lots of them too. But a lot of work goes into making papers. And what I think you really need to do as an executive team member, and hopefully you need to receive positively as a trustee, is trying to write papers that help you articulate your own thinking as a benefit to your own reflection. So if you're writing papers for the sake of writing papers, it's not really helping anyone, because it creates reading work for the trustees and it creates authoring work for whoever's writing them. Whereas if actually you can write papers about genuine things of importance that help you gather your own thoughts, because it means every quarter you get this opportunity to have a sort of consolidated narrative about the situation. So making sure the papers are needed is important. The other thing I'd say is, how do you engage with trustees outside of our main meetings are quarterly. That is a long time for a volunteer to forget everything that you talked about last time. And it can be very easy in a trustee board meeting to talk about the format of the risk register and not the risks. So how do you keep things consistent and easily digestible so that you can get on to the conversations that really matter? Because everybody wants that, but everybody has the capacity to be distracted.
Definitely. And I think so I'm in the second term, so 4 years in, and the sort of papers were definitely sort of quite significant, but actually being part of a board who every board member would say, is this information, you're using this for yourself as well, don't just prepare it for us, really it is about the clarity, the succinctness, the synthesis, but also like these are the indicators of the health of the organisation. So there's definitely kind of, I think, still some space to do that because there's safety in information in some cases. But in terms of those sort of frequent touch points, so I spend time with the sort of director of fundraising and comms, kind of we do like pre-landing. So does this make sense to you? How do you think the Finance and Investment Committee are going to respond to this? So I do, like personally as a trustee, feel like part of my job is to also support the executive team on how they are landing messages for subject matters that are not what the trustee's background is. So I'm bringing that sort of digital, that technology, but also fundraising sector, like this is what's going on. So I can bring backup case studies, and I've seen this in 3 other organisations. So, what you're saying, that is what's happening. And do you feel that benefit from your trustees in terms of actually get, them really creating conditions, I think, for you and your team to really kind of thrive?
Yeah, I mean, they're very supportive, and we, as we are sort of, doing a lot of work in the organisation and we've got an ambitious roadmap, we created an extra informal group as a sounding board that has got some terms of reference now. It started off, really informal, but we're like, okay, let's put some shape around this. But specifically, it doesn't require papers. It can be called, at short notice. And a couple of things have come up where you're like, I need to talk to someone about this and I can't wait 3 months. And so not least of all, in one example, there was 2 weeks to send a response to someone about an opportunity, and it was of sufficient importance or complexity or potential risk that it would have to be seen by trustees. So having a sort of understood informal way of getting, and I also now write a month note to all trustees about what's going on to help just keep that extra touch point of here's what's happening in the organisation, so that when I get to the update quarterly, everybody's had just a few reminders and they feel like they've been in touch with the organisation.
Yeah, we get sort of week notes and we're invited to all the...
Don't up it anymore.
Sorry everyone, sorry. Short and sharp, it's, a few links, but it's super, you just sort of, they draw attention to stuff, but also being invited into kind of team meetings. So we've done like trustee spotlight. So I've explained to everyone why I wanted to be a trustee, what my background is, just to kind of build that connection. Because I think, historically in the sector, governance, and we can do a whole episode on governance, but kind of sort of trustees have sort of been in this sort of secluded tower, very kind of removed from the organisation. I feel like now, actually, if you think about amazing governance, like you're connected into that organisation in a slightly more meaningful way, and you are there to add value, not just sign the audit once a year to make sure that, which is absolutely important, and you do need to read the annual
I think
report.
It's remembering what mode you're in. Because some of them, there is a governance mode. So am I in governance mode? Am I in value add mode? It's not that obviously governance does add value, but what mode are you in as a trustee? And I think sometimes challenges occur when you get out of sync, because if you have a long finance and audit related conversation and then the next item on the agenda is an innovation conversation, it's like, have you led everybody into not being very effective at innovating because of what you've talked about before? So I also think, and I do quite a lot of work with my chair on structuring the agenda, and we also do a run through of the meeting after papers have gone out before the meeting happens, of like where the conversation may go and have we got what we need. So
Definitely, I cannot stress enough the value for anyone who doesn't do it or rehearsal for those kind of meetings, or it doesn't matter if it's a project or a program. What
do we want to get out of this meeting? How could it go? It's invaluable. People don't do it. We know someone who, the art of pre-landing, the pre-landing.
That's true.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big rehearser, so I sort of both like observe the value of it for a lot of people, and also find it very hard to do myself.
I think it's a really good tactic when you've got to take a sort of a leadership team into a room who may be less comfortable with the audience, and like this is the level that I need you to talk at. We're talking like we're working, or traction, working on the business, not in the business today. So this is the quality of conversation that we should be having. Yeah.
Can we deep dive very briefly into the charity sector? So we've all kind of orbited it, been in it for, decades. When I think about the future leaders of the sector, so the next generation of CEOs, the next executive leaders, what do organisations, and I guess like boards, right, they're so influential on like who gets appointed, like what should they be thinking about the types of people, the type of backgrounds and skills that they're, are going to take them forward, as opposed to really it's, well, this person's already done this job at another organisation, so they could do it here, which of course is true in so many ways, but you don't know what you don't know. So
yeah, I mean, I think every organisation is different, and every moment in time in an individual organisation is different. So what an organisation needs in a certain moment, it may be different. And I think what designability needed before me wasn't me. My predecessor did quite a lot of, I suppose, what you describe as professionalization, a lot of operational improvement, and then I think it needed someone more entrepreneurial and more commercial. If I absolutely crack the pot of gold conundrum for designability, there may come a point in the future where someone who's just really great at spending all that money is the best person to have in the role. As we'll paraphrase, but I think so. There's what is your situation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, layer in what's going on in the outside world and what's going on in your subsector of the not-for-profit sector would be what I think about. Of course, there are those sort of macro things like AI and changes to the workplace based on the tools and technology that are available, and the aftermath of hybrid working and where we're up to in how often people could or should be at the office and things like that do have an impact, but those are often about, is the person's outlook and values and their behaviours aligned to what you're trying to be as an organisation? And I think that's where you get into, or are they here to shape it, of course, and change it? Yeah. And I think that's where a huge amount of responsibility lies on the shoulders of trustees, where they choose people to put into leadership roles, and they are, unpaid volunteers, often doing very busy full-time jobs themselves. And so can you get sufficient time, energy, thought and input from them? Of course, from lots you can. But I think what you have to do if you're the other exec members of the team is just make sure that enough of the right conditions are being created for those hires.
People that know you will naturally, I think, connect you to having energy. But, we know that it's not an infinite an infinite bucket. So, and I think, as leaders, you talked about cognitive load. As leaders, that's something that we're grappling with every day. The things that you can't do often take up more headspace than the things that you can. So what do you do to keep energized, manage your energy, like at work in this role?
I used to just rely on sheer energy for a great period of the time that I ran Manifesto. But towards the latter part of it, I became ill at times, and I couldn't offer the same energy. And just as I was finishing at Manifesto or TPX, I had long COVID and found working, I think at the time I was working 3 days a week, and I found even that pretty exhausting. It was sort of fortunate that coincided with me ramping down. So I think, as I've got slightly older, one of the things I've learned is you can't always offer quite the same energy. And one of my reflections on my whole Manifesto journey was, I think if I'd have done 25% less, I don't think the outcome would have been any different, as long as I picked the right 25% not to do, which, so maybe I wouldn't, because I did a lot of late nights. I enjoyed a lot of free bars. I made my own working life substantially harder by choosing to go to so many things and then write proposals at weekends and overwork really. And at the time I wouldn't have described it as that. So now I just try and take enough time to be productive when I really can be, and recognize times when I can't quite offer the same and find other times to do more. And you know, I had a couple of months while I've been at Designability where I wasn't 100% well. And you know, that really makes you think about what are the most important things I can do. And also what I've done is add real cadence. So using sort of quarterly planning and that sort of cycle and rhythm that is not dissimilar to what comes from Traction to help frame priorities and then work on those. And the other thing that I'm better at than I was when I worked here was really my leadership team run the organisation, and I'm sort of compare and host really.
Oh, well, your perfect role.
Dream job. Yeah, thank you. You're right. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and it's okay. You know, elite athletes don't run their personal best every day, so it's okay for us to, you know, to respond to what's going on in our bodies, in our brains, and know when you need to really put the foot on the accelerator.
And I credit Jim and Rebecca for helping me realise how I show up, what are my personal kind of preferences, and kind of really reflecting on actually some of my personal drivers. It doesn't mean I need to do everything all the time. Actually, my value is in different ways. So like the last 5.5 years of being in both of yours orbit have been really quite instrumental to my personal growth. So I just wanted to acknowledge that for everyone. So do reach out to Rebecca and Jim. Okay, I'm going to wrap us up, even though we could talk forever. And maybe we'll do more. So what's next for Jim Bowes and what's next for Designability?
So Designability, we're going to be kicking off a really exciting piece of research with disabled people to find out about the barriers they experience in everyday life. And we want to really sort of get that down to an index or a list of what are the sort of top 20 things. And we want that to drive our future pipeline of innovation. We want to give us jumping off points to talk to companies and to philanthropists and people that are interested in making a real difference, because we want to be working where the greatest need lies. So that's a huge part of our future. And really, you know, I want to get into a cadence where doing a major piece of research underpins the work that the charity then does. And we know that that's centred in disabled people's needs. For me personally, making that happen, working with my leadership team, helping to diversify the income of the organisation so that we can do as much amazing work as possible. Personally, I'm going on an ice cream making course. Week in Italy.
Oh, wow.
Like
Extreme
properly,
ice cream making. Love
proper
that.
ice cream
Gelato.
course. Yeah.
It's gelato. Yeah, it's gelato.
Amazing. Well, have an incredible time in Italy. Thank you for sparing the time.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's been an absolute pleasure. I never thought this would happen. Obviously, you've been the podcast host, so thank you for being in the guest seat. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure to be back and spend time in your space and to do this.